Chapter 1. Kona Weather. Miss Minerva Winterslip was a Bostonian in good standing, and long past the romantic age. Yet beauty thrilled her still, even the semi-barbaric beauty of a Pacific island. She felt a little catch in her throat that sometimes she had known in Symphony Hall, Boston, when her favorite orchestra rose to some new and unexpected height of loveliness. It was the hour at which she liked Waikiki best, the hour just preceding dinner, and the shadows cast by the tall coconut palms lengthened and deepened. The light of the falling sun flamed on Diamond Head, and tinted with gold the rollers sweeping in from the coral reef. A few late swimmers reluctant to depart dotted those waters whose touch is like the caress of a lover. On the boat, a slim brown girl, poised for one delectable instant. What a figure! Miss Minerva, well over 50 herself, felt a mild twinge of envy. Youth like an arrow, straight and sure and flying. Rose, then fell. The perfect dive, silent and clean. Miss Minerva glanced at the face of the man who walked beside her. But Amos Winterslip was oblivious to beauty. He had made that the first rule of the mainland beyond San Francisco. Yet, there could be no doubt about it. Conscience personified, the New England conscience in a white duck suit. Better turn back, Amos, suggested Miss Minerva. Dinner's waiting. Thank you so much. I'll walk as far as the fence, he said. When you get tired of Ben and his carryings-on, come to us again. We'll be glad to have you. That's kind of you, she answered, in her sharp, crisp way. But I really must go home. Grace is worried about me. Of course, she can't understand. And my conduct is scandalous, I admit. I came over to Honolulu for 6 weeks, and I've been wondering about these islands for 10 months. As long as that? She nodded. I can't explain it. Every day, I make a solemn vow. I'll start packing my trunks. Tomorrow. And tomorrow never comes. And tomorrow never comes, said Amos. You've been taken in by the tropics. Some people are. Weak people. I presume you mean, snapped Miss Minerva. Well, I've never been weak. Miss Minerva. Well, I've never been weak. Ask anybody on Beacon Street. He smiled wanly. It's a strain in the Winterslip, he said. Supposed to be Puritans, but always sort of yearning toward the lazy latitudes. I know, answered Miss Minerva, her eyes on that exotic shoreline. It's what sent so many of them adventuring out of Salem Harbor. Those who stayed behind felt that the travelers were seeing things no Winterslip should look at. But they envied them just the same, or maybe for that very reason. She nodded, a sort of gypsy strain. It's what sent your father over here to set up as a whaler and got you born so far from home. You know you don't belong here, Amos. You should be living in Bilton or Roxbury, carrying a little green bag and popping into a Boston office every morning. I've often thought it, he admitted. And who knows, I might have made something of my life. They had come to something of my life. They had come to a barbed wire fence, an unaccustomed barrier, on that friendly shore. It extended well down onto the beach. A wave rushed up and lapped the final post, then receded. Miss Minerva smiled. Well, then receded. Miss Minerva smiled. Well, this is where Amos leaves off, and Dan begins, she said. I'll watch my chance and run around the end, but you couldn't build it. So it moved with the tide. You'll find your luggage in your room at Dan's, I guess, Amos told her. Remember what I said about her? He broke off suddenly. A stocky, white-clad man had appeared in the garden beyond the barrier, and was moving rapidly toward them. Amos Winterslip stood rigid for a moment, cried Miss Minerva sharply. He moved on, and she followed. Amos, what nonsense. What similar... How long has it been since you spoke to Dan? He paused. Under an algarava tree. There's of yours, and hold out your hand to him. Not me, said Amos. I guess you don't know Dan Minerva and the sort of life he's led. Time and again, he's dishonored us all. Why, Dan's regarded as a big man, she protested. It often goes in this world. But there's a world to come. And over there, I reckon Dan's gonna get his. Hearty soul, though she was, Miss Minerva was somewhat frightened by the look of hate on his thin face. She saw no sign of hearing, but hurried along the white stretch of sand. When Miss Minerva turned, Dan Winterslip was smiling at her from beyond the fence. Hello there, he cried. Come this side of the wire and enjoy life again. You're mighty welcome. Glad to see you, he said, and his eyes backed him up. Yes, he did have a way with... It's a bit lonely at the old homestead these days. Need a young girl about to brighten things up. Miss Minerva sniffed. I've tramped Boston head. Over talk like that. Forget Boston, he urged. We're all young in Hawaiian. Look at me. She did look at him wonderingly. He was 63, she knew, but only the massive wavy white hair overhanging his temples betrayed his age. His face, burned to the deepest bronze by long years of wandering under the Polynesian sun, was without a line or wrinkle. Under the Polynesian sun was without a line or wrinkle. Deep-chested and muscular, he could have passed on the mainland for a man of 40. I see my precious brother brought you as far as the deadline, he remarked as they moved on through the garden. Sent me his love, I presume? Sent me his love, I presume? I tried to get him to come round and shake hands, Miss Minerva said. Dan Winterslip laughed. Don't deprive poor Amos of his hate for me, he urged. It's about all he lives for. Now, comes over every night and stands under that algaroba tree of his smoking cigarettes and staring at my house. Know what he's waiting for? He's waiting for the Lord to strike me down for my sins. Well, he's a patient waiter. I'll say that for him. Well, he's a patient waiter. I'll say that for him. Miss Minerva did not reply. Dan's great rambling house of many rooms was set in beauty, almost too poignant to be borne. She stood, drinking it all in again. She stood, drinking it all in again. The poinciana trees like big crimson umbrellas, the stately golden glow. The gigantic banyans casting purple shadows, her favorite hall tree, seemingly old as time itself, covered with a favorite hall tree, seemingly old as time itself, covered with a profusion of yellow blossoms. Loveliest of all were the flowering vines, the bougainvillea burying everything it touched in brook-red splendor. Miss Minerva wondered what her friends who every spring went into sedate ecstasies over the Boston public gardens would say if they could see what she saw now. They would be a bit shocked, perhaps, for this was too lurid to be quite respectable. Was too lurid to be quite respectable. A scarlet background, and a fitting one, no doubt, for Cousin Van. They reached the door at the side of the house that led directly into the living room. Glancing to her right, Miss Minerva caught through the lush foliage glimpses at the iron fence and tall gates that fronted on Kalia Road. Dan opened the door for her, and she stepped inside. Like most apartments of its sort in the islands, the living room was walled on but three sides. The fourth was a vast expanse of wire screen. They crossed the polished floor and entered the big hall beyond. Near the front door, a Hawaiian woman of uncertain age rose slowly from her chair. She was a huge, high-breasted specimen of that vanishing race. "Well, come right, Cully. I'm back." Miss Minerva smiled. "I make you welcome," the woman said. She was only a servant, but she spoke with the gracious manner of a hostess. First came over. "Minerva, Dan Winterslip announced. Your luggage is there, and a bit of mail that came in on the boat this morning. I didn't trouble to send it up to Amos's. We dine when you're ready. I'll not keep you long," she answered. Winterslip strolled back to his living room. He sat down in a rattan chair that had been made especially for him in Hong Kong, and glanced complacently about at the many evidences of his prosperity. His butler entered, bearing a tray with cocktails. "Two, Paku," smiled Win. "So, yes," hissed Haku, and retired soundlessly. In a moment, Miss Minerva came again into the room. She carried a letter in her hand, and she was laughing. "Dan, this is too absurd. I may have told you that they were getting worried about because I haven't been able to tear myself away from Honolulu. I mean, well, they're sending a policeman for me." "A policeman?" He lifted his bushy eyebrows. "Yes, it amounts to that. Grace writes that John Quincy has 6 weeks vacation from the banking house and has decided to make the trip out here. It will give you someone to come home with, my dear," says Grace. "Isn't she subtle? John Quincy Winterslip?" That Miss Minerva nodded. "You never met him, did you, Dan?" "Well, you will, shortly. And you certainly won't approve of you." "Why not?" Dan Winterslip bristled. "Because he's proper. Is going to be a great cross for him. He'll start disapproving as he passes Albany. And think of the long weary miles of disapproval he'll have to endure after that. I don't know. He's a Winterslip, isn't he? Gypsy strain missed him completely. He's all Puritan. Poor boy." Dan Winterslip moved towards the tray, on which stood the amber-colored drinks. "I suppose he'll stop with Roger in San Francisco. Right in there. He's in Honolulu. It's kind of you, Dan. Not at all. I like youth around me, even Puritan brand. Now that you're going to be apprehended and taken back to the civilization, you better have one of these cocktails. Well, said his guest, to exhibit what my brother used to call true Harvard indifference. What do you mean? Asked Winterslip. I don't mind if I do, twinkled Miss Minerva, lifting a cocktail glass. Dan Winterslip beamed upon her. Dan Winterslip beamed upon her. You're a good sport, Minerva, he remarked, as he escorted her across the hall. When in Rome, she answered, and make it a point not to do as the Bostonians do. I fear it would prove a rather do as the Bostonians do. I fear it would prove a rather thorny path to popularity. Precisely. Besides, I shall be back in Boston soon, tramping about to art exhibits and Lowell lectures, and gradually congealing into senility. But she was not in Boston now. She reflected as she sat down at the Glue table in the dining room. Before her, properly iced, was a generous slice of papaya. Golden yellow and inviting. Somewhere beyond the foliage, outside the screens, the ocean murmured restlessly. The dinner would be perfect, she knew. The island beef dry and stringy. The dinner would be perfect, she knew. The island beef dry and stringy, perhaps. But the fruits and the salad more than a toning. Do you expect Barbara soon? She inquired presently. Dan Winterslip's face lighted like the beach at sunrise. She's graduated. She'll be along any day now. Nice if she and your perfect nephew should hit on the same boat. Nice for John Quincy, at any rate, Miss Minerva replied. We thought Barbara a lively, charming girl when she visited us. His daughter was his dearest possession. I tell you, I've missed her. I've been mighty lonesome. Miss Minerva gave him a shrewd look. Yes, I've heard rumors, she remarked, about how lonesome you've been. He flushed under his tan. Amos? Not only Amos. A great deal of talk, Dan. At your age. What do you mean, my age? I told you, we're all young out here. He ate in silence for a moment. You must understand that here in the islands, a man may behave a bit differently than who would in the back hay. At that, she smiled. All men in the back bay are not to be trusted. Why not select, as the object of your devotion, a woman you could marry? I could marry this one, if we're talking about the same woman. The one I refer to, Miss Minerva replied, is known rather widely as the widow of Waikiki. This place, Arlene Compton, is perfectly respectable. A former chorus girl, I believe. Not precisely. An actress, small parts, and a self-made widow. Just what do you mean by that? He flared. His gray eyes glittered. I understand that when her husband's airplane crashed on Diamond Head, it was because he preferred it that way. She had driven him to it. Lies, all lies. Dan Winterslip cried. Pardon me, Minerva, but you mustn't believe all you hear on the beach. He would leave all you here on the beach. He was silent for a moment. What would you say if I told you I proposed to marry this woman? I'm afraid I'd become rather bromidic, she answered gently, and remind you that there's no fool like an old fool. She answered gently, and remind you that there's no fool like an old fool. He did not speak. Forgive me, Dan. I'm your first cousin, but a distant relative for all that. It's really none of my business. I wouldn't tear, but I like you. None of my business. I wouldn't tear, but I like you. And I'm thinking of Barbara. He bowed his head. I know, he said, Barbara. Well, there's no need to get excited. I haven't said anything to Arlene about marriage. Not yet. This Minerva smiled. As I get on in years, she remarked, so many wise old saws begin to strike me as utter nonsense. Particularly that one I just quoted. He looked at her, his eyes friendly again. This is I ever tasted, she added. But Tommy, Dan, are you sure the mango is a food? Seems more like a spring tonic to me. By the time they finished dinner, the topic of Arlene Compton was forgotten, and Dan had completely regained his good nature. In island parlance, lanai, which opened off one end of the living room. This was of generous size, screened on 3 sides and stretching far down onto the white beach. Outside the brief tropid dusk dimmed the bright colors of Waikiki. No breeze turtle. The trains had died, Dan answered. He referred to the beneficent winds, which, save at rare, uncomfortable intervals, blow across the islands out of the cool northeast. I'm afraid we're in for a stretch of calm. As Minerva said, it saps the life right out of me nowadays. He told her and sank into a chair. That about being young, Minerva, it's a little bluff I'm fond of. She smiled gently. Even youth, I remember when I was here before, in the 80s. I was only 19, but the memory of the sick wind lingers still. I missed you then, Minerva. Yes, you were off somewhere in the South Seas, but I heard about you when I came back. And nowhere near so prim as they feared you were going to be. A wonderful figure, they said, that you got that yet. She flushed, but smiled still. Hush. We don't talk that way where I come from. That was Hawaii then. Unspoiled, a land of opera buffet, with old Kalakaua sitting on his golden throne. I remember him, as Minerva said, grand parties at the palace, and the afternoons when he sat with his Hawaiian band played at his feet, and he haughtily tossed them royal pennies. It was such a colorful, naive spot then, Dan. It's been ruined, he complained sadly. Too much aping of the mainland. Too much of your damned mechanical civilizations, radios, back. And yet, Minerva, away down underneath, there are deep, dark waters flowing still. She nodded, and they sat for a moment, busy with their memories. Presently, I'll just glance at the evening paper, if you don't mind. Oh, do, urged Miss Minerva, and she was glad of a moment without talk. For this, after all, was the time she loved Waikiki best. So brief, this tropic, the coming of the soft, alluring night, the carpet of the waters, apple green by day, crimson and gold at sunset, was a deep purple now. On top of that extinct volcano called Diamond Head, a yellow eye was winking, as though to hints a yellow eye was winking, as though to hints there might still be fire beneath. 3 miles down, the harbor lights began to twinkle, and out toward the reef, the lanterns of Japanese sampans glowed intermittently. Beyond in the roadstead, sampans glowed intermittently. Beyond in the roadstead loomed the battered hulk of an old brig, slowly moving toward the channel entrance. Always, out there, a ship or two, in from the east with a cargo of spice or tea or ivory or two, in from the east with a cargo of spice or tea or ivory or eastward bound with a load of tractor salesmen. Ships of all sorts, the spick and span liner and the rakish tramp ships from Melbourne and Seattle, New York and Yokohama liner, and the rakish tramp ships from Melbourne and Seattle, New York and Yokohama, Tahiti and Rio, any port on the 7 seas. For this was Honolulu, the crossroads of the Pacific, the glamorous crossroads where they said in time all paths crossed again. Miss Minerva sighed. She was conscious of a quick movement on Dan's part. She turned and looked at him. He had laid the paper on his knee. She turned and looked at him. He had laid the paper on his knee and was staring straight ahead. That bluff about being young, no good now, for his face was old. Why, Dan, she said. I'm wondering, Minerva. He began slowly. Tell me again about that nephew of yours. She was surprised, but fitted. John Quincy? She said, he's just the usual thing for Boston. Conventional. His whole life has been planned for him, from the cradle to the grave. So far, he's walked the line. The inevitable preparatory school, Harvard, the proper clubs, the family banking house, even gone and got himself engaged to the very girl his mother would have picked for him. There have been times when I hoped he might kick over the war. No. He came back and got meekly into the old rack. Then he's reliable, steady. Miss Minerva smiled. Dan, compared with that boy, Gibraltar rabbles occasionally. Discreet, I take it. He invented discretion. That's what I'm telling you. I love him, but a little bit of recklessness now and then. However, I'm afraid it's too late now. John Quincy is nearly 30. Dan Winterslip is on his feet, his manner that of a man who had made an important decision. Beyond the bamboo curtain that hung in the door, leading to the living room, a light appeared. Aku, Winterslip called. The Jap came swiftly. Haku, tell the chauffeur. Quick, the big car. I must get to the dock before the president Tyler sails for San Francisco. Wiki. Tyler sails for San Francisco. Wiki. The servant disappeared into the living room, and Winterslip followed. Some were puzzled. Miss Minerva sat for a moment, then rose and pushed aside the curtain. Are you sailing, Dan? Are you sailing, Dan? She asked. He was seated at his desk, writing hurriedly. No. Just the note and let's get it off on that boat. There was an air of suppressed excitement about get it off on that boat. There was an air of suppressed excitement about him. Miss Minerva stepped over the threshold into the living room. In another moment, Haku appeared with an announcement that was unnecessary, for the engine of an automobile was unnecessary, for the engine of an automobile was humming in the drive. Dan Winterslip took his hat from the jack. "Make yourself at home, Minerva. I'll be back shortly," he cried, and rushed out. Dan and Amos and her uncle. Dan had had it painted with a photograph after the old man's death. It was the work of an artist whose forte was reputed to be landscapes. Oh, it must assuredly have been landscapes set up in Honolulu as a whaler. The only time she had seen him, in the 80s, he had been broken and old, mourning his lost fortune, which had gone with his ships in an Arctic disaster a short time before. Well, Dan had brought the family back, so there were about the methods of Bostonians who had never strayed from home. A charming fellow, whatever his past. Miss Minerva sat down at the grand piano and played a few old familiar bars. The beautiful blue Danube. Her thoughts were Kalakaua Avenue. But it was the present that concerned him when they reached the dock, and he ran, panting a little through a dim pier shed, toward the gangplank of the President Tyler. He had no time to spare. The ship was on the point of sailing. Since it was even so, there were cries of aloha, some hearty and some tremulous. Most of the travelers were bedecked with leaves, and a confused little crowd milled about the foot of the plank. Dan Winterslip pushed his way forward and ran up the sharp incline. As he reached the deck, "You're the man I'm looking for," he cried. "How are you?" Sir Hepworth said. "I didn't see your name on the list." "No, I'm not sailing. I'm here to ask a favor." "Glad to oblige. Mr. Winterslip." Winterslip thrust Mr. Winterslip. Winterslip thrust a letter into his hand. "You know my cousin Roger in Frisco. Please give him him and no one else, as soon after you land as you possibly can. After you land as you possibly can. I'm too late for the mail, and I prefer this way anyhow. I'll be mighty grateful. Don't mention it. You've been very kind to me, and I'll be only too happy. I'm afraid you'll have to go ashore, sir. Only too happy. I'm afraid you'll have to go ashore, sir." "Minute there." He took Winterslip's arm and gently urged him back onto the plank. The instant Dan's feet touched the dock, the plank was drawn up behind him. For a moment he stood, held the dock. The plank was drawn up behind him. For a moment he stood, held by the fascination an islander always feels at sight of a ship outward bound. Then he turned and walked slowly through the pier shed. Ahead of him, he caught a glimpse of a slender through the pier shed. Ahead of him, he caught a glimpse of a slender live figure, which he recognized at once as that of Dick Kaiola, the grandson of Kamaikui. He quickened his pace and joined the boy. "Hello, Dick," he said. "Hello?" Joined the boy. "Hello, Dick," he said. "Hello?" The brown face was sullen. "You haven't been to see me for a long time," Dan Winterslip said. "Everything all right?" "And sure," replied Kaiola. "And sure," replied Kaiola. "Sure, it's all right." They reached the street, and the boy turned quickly away. "Good night," he muttered. Dan Winterslip stood for a moment, thoughtfully looking after him. Thoughtfully looking after him. Then he got into the car. "No hurry now," he remarked to the chauffeur. When he reappeared in his living room, Miss Minerva glanced up from the book she was reading. "Were you in time, Ben?" "Time, Ben?" she asked. "Just made it," he told her. "Good," she said, rising. "I'll take my book and go upstairs." Pleasant dreams. He waited until she reached the door. He waited until she reached the door before he spoke. "Ah, Minerva, don't trouble to write your nephew about stopping here." "No, Dan?" she said, puzzled again. "No, I'd attended to the invitation myself. I'd attended to the invitation myself. Good night." "Oh, good night," she answered, and left him. Alone in the great room, he paced restlessly back and forth over the polished floor. In a moment, he went out, but something seemed to trouble him. His eyes kept straying. With a sharp exclamation, he tore one corner from the shipping page, savagely ripped the fragment to bits. Again, he got up, wandered about. He had intended to return to the lanai. There, under a mosquito netting, was the cot where he preferred to sleep. His dressing room was near at hand. However, it was too early for bed. He stepped through the door onto the beach. Unmistakable, the snow moon, the stars that usually seemed so friendly and so close, were now obscured. The black water rolled in like a threat. He stood staring out into the dark, out there to the crossroads where paths always crossed again. If you give him time, the flare of a match. His brother, Amos. He had a sudden friendly feeling for Amos. He wanted to go over and talk to him. Talk of the far days when they played together on this beach. No use, he knew. He sighed, and the screen door was turned toward the curtain of bamboo between him and the living room. On that curtain a shadow appeared, was motionless a second, then vanished. He caught his breath. Again the shadow. "Who's there?" he called. "Framed there." "Your fruit I put on the table," said Kamaikuri. "I go bed now. And of course, Go ahead." "Good night." The woman withdrew. Dan Winterslip was furious with himself. What was the matter with him? Anyhow? He who had fought his way through unspeakable terrors in early days, nervous on edge. "Getting old," he muttered. "No. By heaven." "Getting old," he muttered. "No. By heaven. It's the Kona." And that's it. The Kona. I'll be all right when the trades blow again. When the trades blew again. He wondered, here at the crossroads, one could not be sure. Chapter 2. The Hi-Hat. John Quincy Winterslip walked aboard the ferry at Oakland, feeling rather limp and weary. For more than 6 days he had been marooned on sleepers. His pause at Chicago had been but a flitting from one train to another, and he was fed up. Seeing America first, that was what he had been doing. And what an appalling lot of it there was. He felt that for an eternity he had been staring at endless plains, dotted here and there by unaesthetic houses the inmates of which had unquestionably never heard a symphony concert. Ahead of him ambled a porter, bearing his 2 suitcases, his golf clubs, and his hat box. One of the man's hands was gone, chewed off, no doubt. In some amiable frontier scuffle. In its place he wore a steel hook. Well, no one could question the value of a steel hook to a man in the porter's profession. But how quaint and western. The boy indicated a spot by the rail on the forward deck, and the porter began to unload. Carefully selecting the man's good hand, John Quincy dropped into it a tip so generous as to result in a touching of hook to cap in a weird salute. The object of this attention sank down amid his elaborate trappings, removed a straw hat from his perspiring head, and tried to figure out just what had happened to him. 3,000 miles from Beacon Street, and 2,000 miles still to go. Why? He inquired sourly of his usually pleasant self. Had he ever agreed to make this absurd expedition into heathen country? Here was late June. Boston was at its best. Tennis at Longwood, long mild evenings in a single shell on the Charles, weekends, and golf with at Magnolia. And if one must travel, there was Paris. He hadn't seen Paris in 2 years, and had been rather planning a quick run over when his mother had put this preposterous notion into his head. Preposterous! It was just as a gentle hint to Aunt Minerva to return to her calm, well-ordered life behind purple window panes on Beacon Street. And was there any chance that his strong-minded relative would take the hint? Not 1 in 1,000. Aunt Minerva was accustomed to a shocked recollection of one occasion when she had said she would do as she damn well pleased. John Quincy wished he was back. He wished he was crossing Boston Common to his office on State Street, there to put out a new issue of bonds. He wasn't yet a member of the firm, accorded only to Winterslips, who were bald and a little stooped, but his heart was in his work. He put out a bond issue with loving apprehension, waiting for the verdict as a playwright waits behind the scenes on a first night. Would those, or would they flop at his feet? The hoarse boom of a ferry whistle recalled John Quincy to his present unbelievable location on the map. The boat began to move. He was dimly conscious of a young person of feminine gender who came and sat on the slip and out into the harbor. The ferry carried John Quincy. And he suddenly sat up and took notice, for he was never blind to beauty, no matter where he encountered it. And he was encountering beauty now. The morning air was keen and dry. Before him was that harbor, which is like a tired navigator's dream come true. They passed Goat Island, and he heard the faint echo of a bugle. He saw Tamalpais lifting its proud head toward the sparkling sky. He turned, and there was San Francisco, its many hills. The ferry plowed on, and John Quincy sat very still. A forest of masts and steam funnels. Here was the waterfront that had supplied the atmosphere for those romantic tales that held him spellbound when he was a boy at school. A quiet young Winterslip in the gypsy strained mist. Now he could distinguish a bark from Antwerp, a great liner from the Orient, or 5-masted schooner that was reminiscent of those supposedly forgotten stories. Ships from the treaty ports. Ships from coconut islands and southern seas. A picture as intriguing and colorful as a backdrop in a theater, but far more real. Suddenly, John Quincy stood up. A puzzled look had come into his calm gray eyes. I don't understand the sound of his own voice. He hadn't intended to speak aloud. In order not to appear too utterly silly, he looked around for someone to whom he might pretend he had addressed that remark. There was no one about, except the young person, who was obviously feminine, and therefore not to be informally accosted. John Quincy looked down at her. Spanish, or something like that. Blue-black hair, dark eyes that were alight now with the amusement. She was striving to hide a delicate oval face. Cammed a deep brown. He looked again at the harbor. Beauty all about the boat, and beauty on it. Much better than traveling on trains. The girl looked up at John Quincy. She saw a big, broad-shouldered young man with a face as innocent as a child's. A bit of friendliness, she decided instantly, would not be misunderstood. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Oh. I beg your pardon," she said. "Oh. I'm sorry," he stammered. "I didn't mean I spoke without intending. I said I didn't understand." "You didn't understand what?" "A most amazing thing has happened," he continued. "What?" "A most amazing thing has happened," he continued. He sat down and waved his hand toward the harbor. "I've been here before." She looked perplexed. "Lots of people have," she admitted. "But you see, people have," she admitted. "But you see, I've never been here before." She moved away from him. "Lots of people haven't." She admitted that too. John Quincy took a deep breath. What was this discussion he got into? Anyhow, quick impulse to lift his hat gallantly and walk away, letting the whole matter drop. He came of a race that sees things through. "I'm from Boston," he said. "Oh," said the girl. That explained everything. Although, of course, there is no reason why I should have dragged you into it. "None whatever," she smiled. "But go on." "Until a few days ago, I was never west of New York. Never in my whole life, you understand. And about New England a bit, and abroad a few times." "I wouldn't say that," protested John Quincy with careful politeness. "But there was such a lot of it. Exploring it seemed a hopeless undertaking. And then the family thought I rode on trains. You'll pardon me, a bit bored. Now, I come into this harbor, I look around me, and I get the oddest feeling. I feel that I've been here before." The girl's face was, "Joy souls they are. You've been a long time coming, but you're home at last." She held out a slim brown hand. "Welcome to your city," she said. John Quincy solemnly shook hands. "Oh no," he corrected. "I belong there, naturally. But this is familiar." He glanced northward at the low hills sheltering the Valley of the Moon, then back at San Francisco. "Yet, I seem to have known my way about here. Once. Astonishing, isn't it? Perhaps some of your ancestors." "That's true," My grandfather came out here when he was a young man. He went home again, but his brothers stayed. It's the son of one. He went home again, but his brothers stayed. It's the son of one of them I'm going to visit in Honolulu. Oh, you're going on to Honolulu? Tomorrow morning. Have you ever been there? Yeah. Her dark eyes were serious. Her dark eyes were serious. See, there are the docks. That's where the East begins. The real East. And Telegraph Hill. She pointed. No one in Boston ever points. But she was so lovely, ever points. But she was so lovely, John Quincy overlooked it. And Russian Hill. And the Fairmont. On life must be full of ups and downs. He ventured lightly. Tell me about Honolulu. Sort of a wild place, I imagine. She laughed. I'll let you discover for yourself how wild it is, she told him. Practically all the leading families came originally from your beloved New England. Puritans with a touch of sun, my father calls them. He's clever, my father, she added, in an odd childish tone that was wistful and at the same time challenging. I'm sure of it, said John Quincy heartily. They were approaching the ferry building. You with that suitcase of yours, but I've got all this truck. If we could find a porter, don't bother, she answered. I can manage very well. She was staring down at John Quincy's hat box. I suppose there's there. She naturally replied John Quincy. She laughed. A rich, deep-throated laugh. John Quincy stiffened slightly. Oh, forgive me, she cried. But a silk hat in Hawaiian. Earl had laughed at a Winterslip. He filled his lungs with the air sweeping in from the open spaces, the broad open spaces where men are men. A weird, reckless feeling stooped, picked up the hat box, and tossed it calmly over the rail. It bobbed indignantly away. The crowd closed in, not wishing to miss any further exhibition of madness. That's that, said John Quincy quietly. Couldn't have done it. And indeed, he shouldn't. The box was an expensive one, the gift of his admiring mother at Christmas. And the topper inside, worn in the gloaming along the water side of Beacon Street, had been known to add a touch of distinction even to that distinguished scene. Why not? Asked John Quincy. The confounded thing's been a nuisance ever since I left home. And besides, we do look ridiculous at times, don't we? We Easterners? A silk hat in the tropics. We Easterners? A silk hat in the tropics. I might have been mistaken for a missionary. He began to gather up his luggage. Shan't need a porter anymore, he announced gaily. I say it was awfully kind of you letting me talk. He announced gaily. I say it was awfully kind of you letting me talk to you. Like that. But it was fun, he told him. I hope you're going to like us out here. We're so eager to be liked, you know? It's almost pathetic. Well, smiled John Quincy. I've met only one Californian today. But, yes, so far so good. Oh, thank you. She moved away. Please, just a moment, called John Quincy. I wish. But the crowd surged between them. He saw her dark eyes surged between them. He saw her dark eyes smiling at him. And then, irrevocably as the hat, she drifted from his sight. Chapter 3. Midnight on Russian Hill. San Francisco. He had taken not more than 3 steps across the floor of the ferry building when a dapper Japanese chauffeur pushed through the crowd and, singling out the Easterner, with what seemed uncanny perspicacity, took complete charge of him. Roger Winterslip, the Jap announced, was too busy to meet ferries, but had sent word that the boy was to go up to the house, and after establishing himself comfortably there, join his host for lunch, downtown. Gratified to feel solid ground once more beneath his feet, John Quincy followed the chauffeur to the street. San Francisco glittered. I always thought this was a foggy town, John Quincy said. The Jap grinned. Maybe fog come. Maybe it do not. Just now, one time, maybe it do not. Please. He held open a pleasant rhythm. They bowled along. Beside the curbs stood the colorful carts of the flower vendors, unnecessarily painted, the lily of existence. Weary traveler though he was, John Quincy took in with every breath a fresh supply of energy. New, better bond issues than ever before seemed ridiculously easy of attainment. Roger Winterslip had not been among those lured to suburban life down the peninsula. He resided in bachelor solitude on Nob Hill. It was an ancient, battered house from without, but within, John Quincy found, were all known comforts. A bent old Chinaman showed him his room, and his heart leaped up when he beheld, at last, a veritable bath. At 1 o'clock, he sought out the office where his relative carried on, with conspicuous success, his business as an engineer and builder. Roger proved a short, forward man in his late 50s. Hello, son? A short, forward man in his late 50s. Hello, son? He cried cordially. How's Boston? And everyone is quite well, said John Quincy. You're being extremely kind. Nonsense. It's a pleasure to see you. Nonsense. It's a pleasure to see you. Come along. He took John Quincy to a famous club for lunch. In the grill, he pointed out several well-known writers. The boy was not unduly impressed. For Longfellow, Whittier, and was not unduly impressed. For Longfellow, Whittier, and Lowell were not among them. Nevertheless, it was a pleasant place. The service perfect. The food of an excellence rare on the Codfish Coast. And what asked Roger presently, do you think of San Francisco? I like it. John Quincy said simply. No. Do you really mean that? Langer beamed. Well, it's the sort of place that ought to appeal to a New Englander. It's had a history, brief, but believe me, my boy, one crowded hour of glorious life. It's sophisticated, knowing, subtle. Contrast it with other cities, for instance. On a favorite topic, and he talked well. Writers, he said at last, are forever comparing cities to women. San Francisco is the woman you don't tell the folks at home an awful lot about. Not that she wasn't perfectly proper. I don't mean that. A little thinner, and her laugh a little gayer. People might misunderstand Besides, the memory is too precious to talk about. Hello? A tall, lean, handsome Englishman was crossing the grill on his way out. Cope! Cope! I knew you at once, he was saying, though it must be more than 40 years since I last saw you. The Britisher dropped into a chair. He smiled a wry smile. My dear old chap, he said. Not so literal, if you don't mind. Rat matter. This is a young cousin of mine, John Quincy Winterslip of Boston. Just what's your title now? Captain. I'm in the Admiralty. Really? Captain. A midshipman, I believe. When we met in Honolulu? I was talking to Dan about you not a year ago. An expression of intense dislike crossed the captain's face. Ah, yes, Dan. Alive and prospering, I presume? Isn't it damnable, remarked Cope, how the wicked thrive. An uncomfortable silence fell. John Quincy was familiar with the frankness of Englishmen, but he was none the less annoyed by this open display of hostility toward his prospective host. Dan's last name was Winterslip. Have a cigarette, suggested Roger. Thank you. Not one of mine, said Cope, taking out a silver case. Virginia tobacco, though they are put up in Piccadilly. Before John Quincy, who refused a bit stiffly. The captain nonchalantly lighted up. I beg your pardon. What I said about your cousin, he began. Really? You know? No matter, I explained the captain. Sailing at 3 today, on the Australian boat. A bit of a job for the Admiralty. From Honolulu, I dropped down to the Fanning Group, a little flock of islands that belongs to us. He added, with filling station, smiled Roger. My dear fellow, the precise nature of my mission is, of course, a secret. Captain Cope looked suddenly at John Quincy. By the way, I once knew a very charming girl from Boston. A relative of yours. A girl? Repeated John Quincy, puzzled. Minerva Winterslip. Why? Said John Quincy, amazed. You mean my Aunt Minerva? The captain smiled. She was no one's aunt in those days. No one's aunt in those days, he said. Nothing auntish about her. But that was in Honolulu, in the 80s. We'd put in there on the old wooden Reliance. The poor unlucky ship was limping home crippled from Samoa. Your aunt was visiting at that port. There were dances at the palace, swimming parties. Ah, me, to be young again. Minerva's in Honolulu now, Roger told him. No. Really?
Yes.
She's stopping with Dan. With Dane. The captain was silent for a moment. Her husband, Minerva, never married, Roger explained. Amazing, said the captain. He blew a ring of smoke toward the paneled ceiling. The more shame to the men of Boston. My time is hardly my own, but I shall hope to look in on her. He rose. This was a bit of luck. Meeting you again, old chap. I'm due aboard the boat very shortly. You understand, of course. He bowed to them both and departed. Fine fellow, Roger said, staring after him. Frank and British, but a splendid chap. I wasn't especially pleased, John Quincy admitted, by the way he spoke of Cousin Dan. John Quincy admitted, by the way he spoke of Cousin Dan. Roger laughed. Better get used to it, he advised. Dan is not passionately beloved. He's climbed high, and he's trampled down a few on his way up. By the way, he wants you to do an errand for him here in San Francisco. Me! Cried John Quincy. An errand. Yes. You ought to feel flattered. Dan doesn't trust everybody. How I feel flattered. Dan doesn't trust everybody. However, it's something that must wait until dark. Until dark, repeated the puzzled young man from Boston. Precisely. In the meantime, I propose to show you about town. But you're busy. I couldn't think of taking you away. Roger laid his hand on John Quincy's shoulder. My boy, no Westerner is ever too busy to show a man from the East about his city. I've been looking forward to this chance for weeks. And since you insist on sailing tomorrow at 10, we must make the most of our time. Roger proved an adept at making the most of one's town and the surrounding country. He brought John Quincy back to the house at 6, urging him to dress quickly for a dinner of which he apparently had great hopes. The boy's trunk was in his room, and as he put on a dinner coat, he looked forward with lively anticipation to a bit of San Francisco nightlife in Roger clothes, and they set out blithely through the gathering dusk. Little place I want you to try, Roger explained as they sat down at a table in a restaurant that was outwardly of no special note. Afterward, we'll look in on that musical show at the Columbia for all the world, particularly this city by the Western Gate. He did not think of himself as a stranger here. He wasn't a stranger, anyhow. The sensation he had first experienced in the harbor returned to him. He had been here before. Strange, but true. He spoke to Roger about it. Roger smiled. A Winterslip after all, he said. And they told me that you were just a sort of Puritan survival. My father used to know that, probably. Just the blood of the roaming Winterslips in your veins. He leaned across the table. How would you like to come to San Francisco to live? What? Asked John Quincy, startled. After them. Make it worth your while. No, thank you, said John Quincy firmly. I belong back east. Besides, I could never persuade Agatha to come out here. Agatha? Who? Agatha Parker. Agatha? Who? Agatha Parker. The girl I'm engaged to.
In a way.
Been sort of understood between us for several years. No, he added, I guess I'd better stay where I belong. Roger Winterslip looked his disappointment. Probably had, he admitted. I fancy. No girl with that name would follow you here. Though a girl worth having will follow her man anywhere, but no matter. He studied John Quincy keenly for a moment. I must have been wrong about you, anyhow. John Quincy felt a sudden resentment. Just, what do you mean by that? He inquired. In the old days, Roger said, Winterslips were the stuff of which pioneers are made. They didn't cling to the apron strings of civilization. They got up some fine morning and nonchalantly strolled off beyond the horizon. Fine morning and nonchalantly strolled off beyond the horizon. They lived, but you're of another generation. You can't understand. Why can't I? Demanded John Quincy. Because the same old rut has evidently been good enough for you. You've never known a thrill, or have you? Have you ever forgot to go to bed because of some utterly silly reason? Because, for example, you were young and the moon was shining on a beach lapped by southern seas? Have you ever lied like a gentleman to protect a woman not worth the trouble? Ever made love to the wrong girl? Of course not. To the wrong girl? Of course not, said John Quincy stiffly. Ever run for your life through crooked streets in the rowdy quarter of a strange town? Ever fought with a ship's officer, the old-fashioned kind, with fists like flying hands? Ever gone out on a manhunt when you got your quarry cornered, leaped upon him with no weapon but your bare hands? Have you ever the type of person you describe, John Quincy cut in, is hardly admirable. Quincy cut in, is hardly admirable. Probably not, Roger agreed. And yet, those are incidents from my own past, my boy. He regarded John Quincy sadly. Yes, I must have been wrong about you. Yes, I must have been wrong about you. A Puritan. Survival after all. John Quincy deigned no reply. There was an odd light in the older man's eyes. Was Roger secretly laughing at him? He appeared to be resentful at the review, which proved to be witty and gay. And Roger and he emerged from the theater at 11, the best of friends again. As they stepped into Roger's car, the older man gave the chauffeur an address on Russian Hill. Dan's San Francisco house, he explained, after John Quincy. He comes over about 2 months each year and keeps the place here. Got more money than I have. Dan's San Francisco house. Oh, said John Quincy. The errand you mentioned? Roger nodded. Yes, top of the limousine, and took an envelope from his pocket. Read this letter. It was delivered to me 2 days ago by the second officer of the President Tyler. John Quincy removed a sheet of notepaper from the envelope. The message appeared to be rather hastily. Dear Roger, he read, you can do me a great service. You and that discreet lad from Boston, who is to stop over with you on his way out here. First of all, give John Quincy my regards, and tell him I'll be delighted to have him about the errand. You have a key to my house on Russian Hill. Go up there. Better go at night when the caretaker's not likely to be around. The lights are off, but you'll find candles in the pantry. There's an old brown trunk, locked. Probably smash the lock, if it is. In the lower section, you'll find a battered, strong box made of Ohio wood and bound with copper. Initials on it. And bound with copper. Initials on it. TMB. Well, about the... Wrap it up and take it away. It's rather an armful, but you can manage it. Have John Quincy conceal it in his luggage. And and some dark night when the ship's about halfway over. I want him to take it on deck and quietly drop it overboard. Tell him to be sure nobody sees him. That's all. But send me a guarded cable when you get the box. Send me a guarded cable when you get the box. And tell him to send me a radio when the Pacific has it at last. I'll sleep better then. Not a word, Roger. Not a word to anyone. You'll understand. Sometimes. You'll understand. Sometimes the dead past needs a bit of help in burying its dead. Your cousin Dan. Solemnly, John Quincy handed the letter back into Roger's keeping. The older man thoughtfully tore it to bits and tossed them through the car window open. The older man thoughtfully tore it to bits and tossed them through the car window open beside him. Well, said John Quincy. Well, a fitting comment eluded him. Simple enough, smiled Roger. If we can help poor old Dan to sleep better as easily as that, if we can help poor old Dan to sleep better as easily as that, we must do it, eh? I suppose so, John Quincy agreed. They had climbed Russian Hill and were speeding along a deserted avenue lined by imposing mansions. Roger leaned forward, going to the corner, and he said to the chauffeur, "We can walk back," he explained to John Quincy. Best not to leave the car before the house. Best not to leave the car before the house. Might excite suspicion. Still, John Quincy had no comment to make. They alighted at the corner and walked slowly back along the avenue. In front of the big stone house, Roger paused. He looked carefully in all directions, then ran with surprising speed up the steps. "Come on," he called softly. John Quincy came. Roger unlocked the door, and they stepped into a dark... John Quincy came. Roger unlocked the door, and they stepped into a dark vestibule. Beyond that, darker still, was a huge hall. The dim suggestion of a grand staircase. Here and there, an article of furniture, shrouded in white, stood like a ghost, marooned but patient. Roger took out a box of matches. "Meant to bring a flashlight," he said, "but I clean forgot. Wait here. I'll hump those candles in the pantry." He was about to sit down on a chair, but it was like sitting on the lap of a ghost. He changed his mind, stood in the middle of the floor, waited. Quiet, deathly quiet. The black had swallowed Roger, explained. John Quincy took his, held it high. A flickering yellow flame accentuated the shadows, was really of small help. Roger led the way up the grand staircase, then up narrower flight. At the foot of still another flight and a stuffy passage on the By gad, I'm getting too old for this sort of thing. I meant to bring a chisel to use on that lock. I know where the tools are. I'll be done. Only a minute. You go on up and locate the trunk. Oh. But nonsense. He was a grown man. He smiled and started up the narrow stair. High above his head, the yellow light of the candle flickered on the brown rafters of the unfinished storeroom. He reached the top of the stairs and paused, creaking back of him now. He was about to turn when a hand reached from behind him and knocked the candle out of his grasp. It rolled on the floor, extinguished. This was downright rude. "See here," cried John Quincy. Who are you?" Something told the boy he had better get ready, but where he came from one had a moment or two for preparation. Knowing supplied a fist, shot out and found his face, and John Quincy Winterslip of Boston went down amid the rubbish of the San Francisco attic, but Boston went down amid the rubbish of the San Francisco attic. He heard for a second the crash of planets in collision, and then the clatter of large feet on the stairs. After that, he was alone with the debris. He got up, thoroughly angry, and began brushing off the dinner coat that had been his tailor's pride. Roger arrived. Who was that? Who was that? He demanded breathlessly. Somebody went down the back stairs to the kitchen. Who was it? How should I know? Inquired John Quincy with pardonable peevishness. He didn't introduce himself to me. His cheek was stinging. He put his handkerchief to it to me. His cheek was stinging. He put his handkerchief to it, and noted in the light of Roger's candle that it was red when it came away. He wore a ring, added John Quincy. Damned bad taste. Hit you, eh? Inquired Roger. Hit you, eh? Inquired Roger. I'll say he did. Look, Roger cried. He pointed. The trunk lock smashed. He went over to investigate. And the box is gone. Poor old Dan. John Quincy continued to brush himself off. Poor old Dan's plight gave him a vast pain, a pain which had nothing to do with his throbbing jaw. A fine nerve. Poor old Dan had to ask a complete stranger to offer his face for punishment in a dusty attic at midnight. What was it all about, anyhow? Roger continued his search. No use, he announced. The box is gone, that's plain. Come on, we'll go downstairs and look about. There's your candle on the floor. John Quincy picked up the candle and relighted it from Roger's flame. Silently, they went below. The outer door of the kitchen stood open. Left that way, said Roger. And, see, he pointed to a window with a broken pane. And that's where he came in. How about the police? Suggested John Quincy. Roger stared at him. The police? I should say not. Where's your discretion, my boy? This is not a police matter. I'll have a new glass put in that window tomorrow. Come on, we might as well go home. We failed. The note of reproof in his voice angered John Quincy anew. They left the extinguished candles on a table in the hall and returned to the street. Well, I'll have to cable Dan, Roger said as they walked toward the corner. I'm afraid he'll be terribly upset by this. Won't tend to endear you to him, either. I can struggle along, said John Quincy. Without his affection. If you could only have held that fellow till I came. Look here, said John Quincy. I was taken unawares. How could I know that I was going up against the heavyweight champion I was going up against the heavyweight champion in that attic. He came at me out of the dark, and I'm not in condition. No offense, my boy, Roger put in. I see my mistake. Went on John Quincy. I should have trained for this trip out here, Quincy. I should have trained for this trip out here. A stiff course in a gymnasium. But don't worry. The next lad that makes a pass at me will find a different target. I'll do a daily 3 dozen, and I'll take target. I'll do a daily 3 dozen, and I'll take boxing lessons. From now on until I get home, I'll be expecting the worst. Roger laughed. That's a nasty cut on your cheek, he remarked. We'd better stop at this drugstore. And the drug clerk ministered to John Quincy with iodine, cotton, and court plaster, and he re-entered the limousine bearing honorably the scar of battle. The drive to Map Hill was devoid of light chatter. Just inside the door of Roger's house, down descended upon them. Barbara, Roger said, where did you come from? Hello, old dear, she cried, kissing him. I motored up from Burlingame, spending the night with you on sale, Roger. He deserves a kiss, too. He's had a bad evening. The girl moved swiftly toward the defenseless John Quincy. Again, he was unprepared, and this time, it was his unpleasantly. And just by way of welcome, Barbara laughed. She was blonde and slender. John Quincy thought he had never seen so much energy imprisoned in so slight a form. I hear you're bound for the islands. John Quincy answered, on your boat. Splendid, she cried. When did you get in? John Quincy came this morning, Roger told her, and he's had a bad evening. The girl said, how lucky I came along. Taking them, at this hour, I'll be getting along upstairs, he ventured. Why? It's just after 12, said Barbara. Lots of places open. You dance, don't you? Let me show you. 6. I stammered John Quincy. His cheek was throbbing, and he thought longingly of that bed in the room upstairs. What a place, this West City, all life. Rather pleasant sort at that. John Quincy took up his hat. Roger's chauffeur had lingered a moment before the house to inspect his engine. When he saw them coming down the steps, he looked as though he rather wished. It was impossible. He climbed to his place behind the wheel. Where to, Barbara? Roger asked. Tate's? Not Tate's, she answered. I've just come from there. What? I thought you motored in from Burlingame. I've traveled a bit since then. How about some chop suey for this Boston boy? Good Lord, John Quincy thought. Was there anything in the world he wanted less? No matter. Barbara took him among the Chinese. He didn't give a hang whose restaurants interested the girl next. At the moment, he was unsympathetic toward Italy and even toward France. But he struggled on the international round, affronting his digestion with queer dishes, and dancing thousands of miles, with the slim Barbara in his arms. After scrambled eggs at a place called Pete's Fashion, she consented to call it an evening. As John Quincy staggered into Roger's house, the great clock in the hall was striking 3. The girl was still alone into Roger's house. The great clock in the hall was striking 3. The girl was still alert and sparkling. John Quincy hastily concealed a yawn. "All wrong to come home so early," she cried. "But we'll have a dance or two on the boat. By the way," and cried. "But we'll have a dance or two on the boat. By the way," I've been wanting to ask. "What does it mean?" "Be in your cheek." "What? Why ere I?" John Quincy remarked. Over the girl's shoulder, he saw Roger violently shaking his head. "Oh, that," said John Quincy, lightly touching the wool. "That's where the West begins." Good night. I've had a bully time. And at last he got upstairs. He stood for a moment at his bedroom window. Gazing down at the torchlight procession of the streets through this amazing city. He was a little dazed. That soft, warm presence close by his side in the car. Pleasant. Very pleasant. Remarkable girls out here. Different. Beyond shone the harbor lights. That other girl, because she had laughed at him. His treasured hat box floated now forlorn on those dark waters. He yawned again. Better be careful. Mustn't be so easily influenced. No telling where it would end. Chapter 4. A friend of trains on which the fog maybe did not come. Roger and his guests were in the limousine again. It seemed to John Quincy they had left it only a few minutes before. So it must have seemed to the chauffeur, too. As sleepy-eyed, he hurried. "By the way, John Quincy," Roger said, "you'll want to change your money before you go aboard." John Quincy gathered his wandering thoughts. "Oh, yes. Of course," he answered. "Roger's to change it for." He inquired. "Why?" began John Quincy. He stopped. "Why, I always thought—" "Don't pay any attention to Roger, Barbara. Little matter, like 3 a.m. made no difference to her. Only about one person out of 1,000 in this country knows that Hawaii is a part of the United States, and the fact annoys us deeply over in the islands. Dear old Roger was trying among the 999. Almost did it too," chuckled Roger. "Nonsense," said Barbara. "John Quincy is too intelligent. He's not like that congressman who wrote a letter to the American consul at Honolulu. Did one of them do that?" Smiled John Quincy. "He certainly did. We almost gave up the struggle after that. Then there was the senator who came out on a junket and began a speech with, when I get home to my country." Someone in the audience shouted, "Here there now, you big stiff." It wasn't elegant, of course, but it expressed our feeling perfectly. We're touchy, John Quincy." "Don't blame you a bit," he told her. "I'll be very careful what I say." They had reached the Embarcadero, and the car halted before one of the piers. The chauffeur descended and began to gather up the baggage. Roger and John Quincy took a share of it, and they traversed the pier shed to the gangplank. "Get along to your office, Roger," Barbara said. No hurry, he answered. Office, Roger, Barbara said. No hurry, he answered. I'll go aboard with you, of course. Amid the confusion of the deck, a party of girls swept down on Barbara. Pretty lively girls, in the California rain. John Quincy learned with some regret, but they were there only to see Barbara off. A big, broad-shouldered man in white pushed his way through the crowd. Hello there. He called to Barbara. Hello, Harry. She answered. You know Roger, don't you? John Quincy was extremely good-looking. His face was deeply tanned by the island sun, his hair blonde and wavy, his gray eyes amused and cynical. Altogether, he was the type of man women look at twice and never forget. John Quincy felt himself at once supplies of Barbara's friends. Jennison seized the boy's hand in a firm grip. Sailing to Mr. Winterslip, he inquired. That's good. Between us, we ought to be able to keep this young woman entertained. The shortgen increased. Along the deck came a little old lady, followed by a Chinese woman servant. They walked briskly, and the crowd gave way before them. Hello, this is Luck, cried Roger. Ned and Maynard. Just a moment. I want you to meet a cousin, John Quincy. I give him into your church. Couldn't find a better guide, philosopher and friend for him. If I combed the islands. The old lady glanced at John Quincy. Her black eyes snapped. Another Winterslip, huh? Hawaii's all cluttered up with them now. Well, the more the merrier. I know your aunt. Stick close to her, John Quincy, Roger admonished. She shook her head. I'm 1,000,000 years old, she protested. The boys don't. However, I'll keep my eye on him. My good eye. Well, Roger, run over sometime. And she moved away. A grand soul, said Roger, smiling after her. You'll like her. Old missionary family? Asked John Quincy. Him? Roger glanced over to where Mr. Jennison stood, the center of an admiring feminine group. Oh, he's Dan's lawyer. One of the leading citizens of Honolulu. Himself, isn't he? An officer appeared, herding the reluctant throng toward the gangplank. I'll have to leave you, John Quincy. A pleasant journey. When you come through on your way home, give me a few more days. John Quincy laughed. You've been mighty kind. Not at all. Roger shook his hand warmly. Take care of yourself. Over there. Hawaii's a little too much like heaven to be altogether safe. So long, my boy, so long. Saw him kiss Barbara affectionately, and with her friends, join the slow procession ashore. A young man from Boston stepped to the rail. Several hundred voices were calling admonitions, promises, farewells. With that holiday spirit, so alien to John Quincy's experience, those ashore were throwing confetti. The streamers grew in number, making a tangle of color, a last frail bond with the land. The gangplank was taken up. Clumsily, the President Tyler began to draw away from the pier. On the topmost deck, a band was playing Aloha, the sweetest, most melancholy song of goodbye ever written. John Quincy was amazed to feel a lump of goodbye ever written. John Quincy was amazed to feel a lump rising in his stomach. The frail, gay-colored bond was breaking now. A thin-veined hand at John Quincy's side waved a handkerchief He turned to find Mrs. Quincy's side, waved a handkerchief. He turned to find Mrs. Maynard. There were tears on her cheeks. "Silly old woman," she said. "Sailed away from this town 128 times. Actual count. I keep a diary. Cried 8 times. Actual count. I keep a diary. Cried every time. What about... I don't know." The ship was well out in the harbor. Now, Barbara came along Jennison trailing her. The girl's eyes were trailing her. The girl's eyes were wet. "An emotional lot. We islanders," said the old lady. She put her arm about the girl's slim waist. "Here's another one of them. Living way off the way we do. Any goodbye at all. It saddens us." She and Barbara moved on down the deck. Jennison stopped. His eyes were quite dry. "First trip out?" he inquired. "Hope you'll like us," Jennison said. "Not Massachusetts, of course, but we'll do our best to make you feel at home. It's a way we have with strangers." "I'm sure I shall have a bully time," John Quincy remarked, but he felt somewhat depressed. Scientific mistake ceases with the borders of Robert Player's evacuation. He waved to someone he fancied might be Roger on the dock, and went to find his stateroom. He learned that he was to share his cabin with 2 missionaries. One was a tall, gloomy old man with a lemon-colored face, the foreign field named Upton. The other was a ruddy-cheeked boy whose martyrdom was still before him. John Quincy suggested drawing lots for a choice of berths, but even this mild form of gambling appeared distasteful to these emissaries of the church. "You boys take the berths," said Upton. "Leave me the couch. I'll sleep well anyhow." His tone was that of one who prefers to suffer. John Quincy politely objected. After further discussion, it was settled that he was to have the upper berth, the couch. The Reverend Mr. Upton seemed disappointed. He had played the role of martyr so long. He resented seeing anyone else in the part. The Pacific was behaving in a most unfriendly manner, tossing the great ship about as though it were a piece of driftwood. Decided to dispense with lunch, and spent the afternoon reading in his berth. By evening he felt better, and under the watchful and somewhat disapproving eyes of the missionaries, arrayed himself carefully at dinner. His name being Winterslip, he had been invited at the captain's table. He found Madame Maynard, serene and twinkling. At the captain's right, Barbara at his left, and Jennison at Barbara's side. It appeared that oddly enough there was an aristocracy of the islands. An outpost like Hawaii took his proper place as a matter of course. Mrs. Maynard chatted brightly of her many trips over this route. Suddenly she turned to Barbara. "How does it happen, my dear," she asked, "that you're not on the college boat?" "Nonsense," said the frank old lady. "You could have got on." But then she looked meaningly toward Jennison. "I presume this ship was not without its attraction." The girl flushed slightly and made no reply. "What?" John Quincy inquired. "Children from Hawaii at school on the mainland." The old lady explained that every June around this time, they practically fill a ship. "We call it the college boat. This year, it's the Matsonia." She left San Francisco to deport her, Barbara said. "I do wish we could beat her in." "Captain, what are the chances?" "Well, that depends," replied the captain cautiously. "She isn't due until Tuesday morning," Barbara persisted. Wouldn't it be a lark if you were persistent? Wouldn't it be a lark if you could land us the night before? As a favor to me, Captain. When you look at me like that, smiled the officer, I can only say that I'll make a supreme effort. I'm just as eager as you to make port on Monday. I'm just as eager as you to make port on Monday. It would mean I could get off to the Orient that much sooner. And then it's settled. Barbara beamed. It's settled. That we'll try, he said. Of course, if I speed up, there's always the chance, he said. Of course, if I speed up, there's always the chance I may arrive off Honolulu after sundown and be compelled to lay by until morning. That would be torture for you. I'll risk it. Barbara smiled. Wouldn't dear old Dad be pleased if I should smile? Wouldn't dear old Dad be pleased if I should burst upon his vision Monday evening? My dear girl, the captain said gallantly, any man would be pleased to have you burst upon his vision any time. There was, John Quincy reflected, much in what the captain said. Up to that moment, there had been little of the romantic in his relations with girls. He was accustomed to look upon them merely as tennis or golf, the opponents, or a fourth of bridge. Barbara would demand a different classification. There was an enticing gleam in her blue eyes, a hint of the eternal feminine in everything she did or said, and John Quincy was no one who was glad that when he left the dinner table, she accompanied him. They went on deck and stood by the rail. Night had fallen. There was no moon. And it seemed to John Quincy that the Pacific was the blackest, angriest ocean he had ever seen. He's sick. John Quincy? Barbara asked. One of his hands was resting on the rail. She laid her own upon it. He nodded. It's a funny thing. I've been abroad a lot, but I never felt like this. When she wept. It's not so very funny, she said gently. This is an alien world you're entering now. Not Boston, John Quincy, nor any other old civilized place. Not the kind of place where the mind rules. Out here, fond of do the wildest, most unreasonable things, simply because their minds are sleeping and their hearts are beating fast. Just remember, please, John Quincy. There was an odd note of wistfulness in her voice. Suddenly, at their side appeared the figure of Harry Jennison, coming for a stroll. Barbara? He inquired. For a moment, she did not reply. Then, she nodded. Yes, she said. And called over her shoulder as she went. Cheer up, John Quincy. He watched her go, reluctantly. She might have stayed to assuage his loneliness. But there she walked along the dim deck, close to Jennison's side. After a time, he sat the smoking room. It was deserted, but on one of the tables lay a copy of the Boston transcript. Delighted, John Quincy pounced upon it, as Robinson Crusoe might have pounced on news from home. The issue was 10 days old, but no matter. He turned at once to the financial pages. There it was, like the face of a well-beloved friend, the record of 1 day's trading on the stock exchange. And up in one corner, the advertisement of his own banking house offering an issue of preferred stock in a Berkshire Cognill He read eagerly preferred stock in a Berkshire Cognill. He read eagerly, but with an odd, detached feeling. He was gone from that world, away out here on a black ocean, bound for Picture Book Islands. Islands where, not so long ago, brown tribes had battled, brown kings ruled. There seemed no link with that world back home. Those gay-colored streamers of confetti, breaking so readily, had... What sort of port would claim him in the end? What? He threw the paper down. The Reverend Mr. Upton entered the smoking room. I left my newspaper here, he explained. Did you care to look at it? Thank you. Picked it up in a great bony hand. I always buy a transcript when I get the chance, he said. It carries me back. You know, I was born in Salem over 70 years ago. John Quincy stared at him. You've been a long time out here? 50 years in the foreign field, answered the old man. I was one of the first to go to the South Seas. One of the first to carry the torch down there. And a dim torch it was, I'm afraid. Afterward, I was regarded him with a new interest. By the way, sir, the missionary continued, I once met another gentleman named Winterslip. Really, said John Quincy. I heard he had returned to Hawaii and prospered. I met him just once. In the 80s, it was on a lonely island in the Gilbert group. It was rather a turning point in his life. More, but the old missionary moved away. I'll go and enjoy my transcript, he smiled. The church news is very competently handled. John Quincy rose and went aimlessly outside. A dreary scene, the swish of turbulent waters, dim figures, aimless as himself, an occasional ship's officer hurrying by. His stateroom opened directly on the deck, and he sank into a steamer chair, just outside the door. In the distance, he saw his room steward, weaving his way in and out of the cabins under his care. The man was busy with his last duties for the night, refilling water carafes, laying out towels, putting things generally to rights. Evening, sir, he said, as he entered John Quincy's room. Presently he came and stood in the door, the cabin light at his back. He was a small man with gold-rimmed eyeglasses and a fierce gray pompadour. Everything okay, Mr. Winterslip? What he inquired, which was... Yes, Bowker smiled. John Quincy. Everything's fine. That's good, said Bowker. He switched off the cabin light and stepped out onto the deck. I aim to take particular care of you, sir. Saw your hometown on the sailing list. I'm an old Boston man, myself. Is that so? Is that so? Said John Quincy cordially. Evidently, the Pacific was a Boston suburb. Not born there. I don't mean the man was, but a newspaper man there for 10 years, but a newspaper man there for 10 years. It was just after I left the university. John Quincy stared through the dark. Harvard? He asked. Dublin, said the steward. Yes, sir. He laughed an embarrassed little. The steward. Yes, sir. He laughed an embarrassed little laugh. You might not think it now, but the University of Dublin, class of 1901. And after that, for 10 years, working in Boston on the Gazette, reporting, copy desk, managing editor for a time. Maybe I bumped into you there, at the Adams House bar, say, on a night before a football game. Quite possible, admitted John Quincy. Quite possible, admitted John Quincy. One bumped into so many people on such occasions. Don't I know it? Mr. Bapper leaned on the rail in reminiscent mood. Great times, sir? Those were the good old days. Went to a grand profession. The Gazette was edited mostly from a place called the Arch Inn. We'll bring our copy to the city editor there. He had a regular table, that sloppy on top, but his desk. If we had a good... John Quincy laughed. Happy days, continued the Dublin graduate, with a sigh. I knew every bartender in Boston well enough to borrow money. Were you ever in that place in the alley back of the Tremont Theater? Tim's place, suggested John Quincy. Yeah, Bo. Now, you're talking. I wonder what became of Tim. Say, and there was that place on Boylston. But they're all gone now, of course. An old pal I met in Frisco was telling me it would break your heart to see the cobweb profession. The newspapers go on consolidating, doubling up, combining the best features of both, and an army of good men go on the town. Good men and true, moaning about the vanished days, and maybe landing in jobs like this one of mine. For you. As a mutual friend of Tim's, as a friend of Tim's, smiled John Quincy. I'll not hesitate to mention it. Sadly, Boker went on down the deck. John Quincy sat lonely again. A couple passed, walking to recognize Jennison and his cousin. Between us, we ought to be able to keep this young woman entertained, Jennison had said. Well, John Quincy reflected. His portion of the entertainment promised to be small. Chapter 5 that followed proved that he was right. He seldom had a moment alone with Barbara. When he did, Jennison seemed always to be hovering nearby, and he did not long delay making the group a threesome. At first, John Quincy resented this, but gradually it didn't matter. Nothing appeared to matter anymore. A great calm had settled over the waters and over John Quincy's soul. The Pacific was one vast sheet of glass, growing a deeper blue with every passing space in a world where nothing ever happened. Nothing could happen. Quiet, restful days gave way to long, brilliant nights. A little walk, a little talk, and that was life. Sometimes John Quincy chatted with Madame Maynard, who had known the islands so many years, had fascinating tales to tell. Tales of the monarchy and the missionaries. The boy liked her immensely. She was a New Englander at heart, despite her glamorous lifetime in Hawaii. That rarity even among college graduates. An educated man. There was no topic upon which he could not discourse at length and brilliantly. In John Quincy's steamer trunk were a number of huge imposing volumes, books he had been meaning to tackle long ago, But it was Barker who read them long ago. But it was Barker who read them, not John Quincy. As the days slipped by, the blue of the water deepened to ultramarine. The air grew heavier and warmer. Underfoot throbbed the engines that were doing their best for Barbara and an early landing. The captain was optimistic. He predicted they would make port late Monday afternoon. But Sunday night, a fierce southern storm swept down upon them and lashed the ship with a wet fury until dawn. When the captain appeared at luncheon Monday noon, worn by a night on the bridge, he shook his head. "We've lost our bet, Miss Barbara," he said. I can't possibly arrive off Honolulu before midnight." Barbara frowned. "But ships sail at any hour," she reminded him. "I don't see why if we sent radios ahead." "No use," he told her. "Radios ahead." "No use," he told her. "The quarantine people keep early hours." "No, I'll have to lay by near the channel entrance until official sunrise about 6. We'll get in ahead of the Matsonia in the mornings. That's the best I can offer you." "You're dear, anyhow." Barbara smiled. "That old storm wasn't your fault. We'll drown our sorrow." "A costume party." She turned to Jennison. "I've got the loveliest fancy dress, Marie Antoinette. I wore it at college." "What do you say, Perry?" "Fine." Jennison answered. "Jean, let's go." Barbara hurried off to spread the news. After dinner that evening she appeared, a blonde vision straight from the French court, avid for dancing. Jennison had rigged up an impromptu pirate dress and was a striking figure. Blonde, weird outfits. On the Pacific boats, a fancy dress party is warmly welcomed and amusingly carried out. John Quincy took small part in the gaiety, for he still suffered from New England inhibitions. At a little past 11, he drifted into seated there alone. "Hello," she said. "Come to keep me company? I've sworn not to go to bed until I see the light on Diamond Head." "I'm with you," John Quincy smiled. "But you ought to be dancing, boy." He paused, seeking an explanation. A fellow can't make a fool of himself in front of a lot of strangers." "I understand," nodded the old lady. "It's a fine delicacy, too, but rather rare, particularly out this way." Flushed and vibrant. "Harry's gone to get me a drink," she panted. She sat down beside Mrs. Maynard. "I've been looking for you, my dear. You know, you haven't read my poem since I was a child. She's simply wonderful. This is a child. She's simply wonderful. This is to John Quincy. Can tell you the most amazing things." Mrs. Maynard vehemently shook her head. "I don't read them anymore," she said. Gave it up. As I've grown older, I've come to understand how foolish it is to peer into the future. Today, that's enough for me. That's all I care to think about." "Oh, please," the girl pouted. The old woman took Barbara's slim hand in hers, and studied the palm for a moment. John Quincy thought he saw a shadow cross her face. Again she shook her head. "Carpe diem," she said. which my nephew once translated as grab the day. Dance and be happy tonight, and let's not try to look behind the curtain. It doesn't pay, my dear. Take an old woman's word for that. Harry Jennison appeared in the door. "Oh, here you are," he said. "I've got your drink, waiting in the smoking room." "I'm coming," the girl said and went. The old woman stared after her. "Poor Barbara," she murmured. "Poor Barbara," she murmured. Her mother's life was none too happy, either. "You saw something in her hand," John Quincy suggested. "No matter," the old lady snapped. "There's trouble waiting for us all. There's trouble waiting for us all, if we look far enough ahead. Now let's go on deck. It's getting on toward midnight." She led him out to the starboard rail. A solitary light like a star gleamed in the distance. Like a star gleamed in the distance. Land at last. "Diamond Head?" John Quincy asked. "No," she said. "That's the beacon on Makapu Point. We shall have to round Cocoa Head before we sight Honolulu." She stood for a moment by the rail, one frail hand resting upon it. "But that's Oahu," she said gently. "That's home. A sweet land, boy. Too sweet, I often think. Land, boy. Too sweet, I often think. I hope you'll like it." "I'm sure I shall," replied John Quincy Gallup. "Let's sit down." They found deck chairs. "Yes, a dear land," she went on. "A dear land," she went on. "There were all sorts in Hawaii, just as it is the whole world over. Honest folks and rascals. From the four corners of the globe men come to us, often because there were no others rot away. I often think it will take a lot of stamina to make good in heaven, and Hawaii's the same." The tall, emaciated figure of the Reverend Mr. Upton appeared before them. He bowed. "Good evening, madam. You're nearly home." "I expect I shall," John Quincy replied. "Just ask him if he recalls that day on Apiang Island in the 80s. But Reverend Frank Upton." "Of course," replied John Quincy. "But a man's past," he said. "However, I understand that the story of Dan Winterslip's early life has always been known in Honolulu." He glanced toward Madame Maynard. "Dan was no saint," she remarked. "We all know that. He crossed that in my humble way. I persuaded him to change his course for the better." "Humph," said the old lady. She was dubious, evidently. John Quincy was not altogether pleased at the turn the conversation had taken. Mr. Upton was continuing. "It was in the 80s. As I told you," said the missionary, "I had a lonely station on Apiang in the Gilbert group. One morning a brig anchored just beyond the reef and a boat came ashore. Of course I was in charge of a dapper, rather handsome young white man. And I saw, even before they beached her, midway in the boat, a long pine box. The white man introduced himself. He said he was First Officer Winterslip of the brig Maid of Shiloh. And when he mentioned the name of the ship, of course I knew at once, knew her unsavory trade and history." He hurried on to history. He hurried on to say that their captain had died the day before, and they had brought him ashore to bury him on land. It had been the man's last wish. Well, the Reverend Mr. Upton stared at the distant shoreline of Oahu. I looked over at that rough pine box. 4 Malay sailors were carrying it ashore. So Tom Braids and Mary said, Young Winterslip nodded. He's in there, right enough, he answered. And I knew I was looking on at the final scene in the career of a famous character of the South Seas. A callous boot scene in the career of a famous character of the South Seas. A callous boot who knew no wall. A pirate and adventurer. The master of the notorious Maid of Shiloh. Tom Braid, the blackbirder. Blackbirder? Queried John Quincy. The missionary birder? Queried John Quincy. The missionary smiled. Ah, yes, you come from Boston. A blackbirder, my boy, is a shipping master who furnishes contract labor to the place. That's so much ahead. Contract labor to the place. That's so much ahead. It's pretty well wiped out now. But in the 80s, a horrible business. The curse of God was on it. Sometimes the laborers came willingly. Sometimes. But mostly, they came at the point of a knife or the muzzle of a gun. A bloody, brutal business. Winterslip and his men went up the beach and began to dig a grave under a coconut palm. I followed. I offered to say a prayer. Winterslip laughed. Not much use, he said. But there on that bright morning under the palm, I consigned to God the soul of a man who had so much to answer for. Bright morning under the palm, I consigned to God the soul of a man who had so much to answer for. Winterslip agreed to come to my house for lunch. He told me that save for a recruiting agent who had remained aboard the brig, he was now the only white agent who had remained aboard the brig. He was now the only white man on the ship. During lunch, I talked to him. He was so young. I discovered this was his first trip. It's no trade for you. He agreed with me. He said he had 200 blacks under the hatches that he must deliver to a plantation over in the Kingsville group, and that after he'd done that, he was through. I'll take the maid back to Sydney, Domini, he promised, and turn her over. I'm going home to Honolulu. The Reverend Mr. Upton rose slowly. I learned later that he kept his word. He finished. Yes. Dan Winterslip went home, and the South Seas saw him no more. I've had few rewards. It's not everywhere that the missionaries have prospered in a worldly way, as they did in Hawaii. He glanced at Madame Maynard. But I've had satisfactions, and one of them arose my bed hour. I must say goodnight. He moved away. John Quincy said, turning this horror over and over in his mind. A Winterslip in the blackbirding business. That was pretty. He wished, little dig for me, the old lady was muttering indignantly. That about the missionaries in Hawaii. And he needn't be so cocky. If Dan Winterslip dropped blackbirding, it was only because he'd found something more profitable. At last, she said. John Quincy rose and stood beside her. Far away, a faint yellow eye was winking. For a moment, the old lady did not speak. Now that's that, she said finally in a low voice. That, she said finally in a low voice. I've seen Diamond Head again. Good night, my boy. Good night, John Quincy answered. He stood alone by the rail. The pace of the President Tyler was slowing perceptibly. The pace of the President Tyler was slowing perceptibly. The moon came from behind a cloud, crept back again. A sort of unholy calm was settling over the hot, airless, deep blue world. The boy felt a strange restlessness. Blue world. The boy felt a strange restlessness in his heart. He ascended to the boat deck, seeking a breath of air. There, in a secluded spot, he came upon Barbara and Jennison, and stopped, shocked. And Jennison, and stopped, shocked. His cousin was in the man's arms, and their bizarre costumes added a weird touch to the scene. They did not see John Quincy, for in their world. See John Quincy, for in their world. At that moment, there were only two. Their lips were crushed together. Fiercely, John Quincy fled. Good Lord. He had kissed a girl or two himself, but it had been like that. He went to the rail outside his stateroom. Well, what of it? Barbara, that was nothing to him. A cousin, yes, but one who seemed to belong to an England. He had sensed that she was in love with Jennison. Then, deep in his heart, he was engaged to Agatha Parker. He gripped the rail and sought to see again Agatha's aristocratic face. But it was blurred, indistinct. All Boston was blurred in his memory. The blood of the Roman birding and hot, breathless kisses in the tropic night. Was it flowing in his veins, too? Oh, Lord. He should have stayed at home where he belonged. Bowker, the steward, came along. Well, here we are, he said, in the morning. I heard they've been having Kona weather out this way, but I imagine this is the tail end of it. There'll be a moon shortly, and by dawn, the old trades will be on the job again. God bless them. John Quincy did not speak, except that one by Adams on revolutionary New England. It's a mighty interesting work. I intend to finish it tonight so I can give it to you before you go ashore. Oh, that's all right. John Quincy said. Honolulu is over there. I take it. Yeah, several miles away. A dead town, sir. They roll up the sidewalks at 9. And let me give you a tip. Keep away from the Opala House. For what? Ask John Quincy. Ask John Quincy. The Opala House. A drink they sell out here. What's it made of? There, said Bowker. You have the plot for a big mystery story. So, what is it made of? Judging by the smell of nothing very lovely. By the smell of nothing very lovely. A few gulps, and you hit the ceiling of eternity. But oh boy, when you drop. Keep off it, sir. I'm speaking as one who knows. I'll keep off it. I'll keep off it, John Quincy promised. Bowker disappeared. John Quincy remained by the rail, that restless feeling growing momentarily. The moon was hidden still. The ship crept along through the muggy darkness. The ship crept along through the muggy darkness. He peered across the black waters toward the strange land that awaited him. Somewhere over there, Dan Winterslip waited for him too. Dan Winterslip, blood relative of the Boston Winterslips, and Slip, blood relative of the Boston Winterslips, and ex-Blackbutter. For the first time, the boy wished he had struck first in that dark attic in San Francisco, wished he had got that strong box and cast it overboard in the night. Strong box and cast it overboard in the night. Who could say what new scandal, what fresh blot on the honored name of Winterslip might have been averted had he been quicker with his fists? As John Quincy turned and entered his cabin, he would linger but briefly at this, his journey's end, a few days to get his breath, perhaps, and then he would set out again for Boston. And Aunt Minerva would go with him, whether she wanted to or not. Beyond the bamboo curtain, had John Quincy been able to see his Aunt Minerva at that moment, he would not have been so sure that he could persuade her to fall in with his plans. He would, indeed, have been profoundly shocked at the picture presented by his supposedly staid and dignified relative. For Miss Minerva was sitting on a grass mat in a fragrant garden in the Hawaiian quarter at Honolulu. Pale, golden Chinese lanterns, inscribed with scarlet letters, hung above her head, the ropes of buff ginger blossoms, twined with nail. The sleepy, sensuous music of ukulele and steel guitar rose on the midnight air, and before her, in a cleared space under the date palms, Hawaiian boys and girls described in great detail when she got back to Beacon Street. Miss Minerva was, in her quiet way, very happy. One of the ambitions of her life had been realized, and she was present at a luau, or native Hawaiian feast. Few Waitelu friends had been invited on this occasion, and had asked her to go with them. At first, she had thought she must refuse, for Dan was expecting Barbara and John Quincy on Monday afternoon. When on Monday evening he had informed her that the President Tyler would not land its passengers until the next day, to the telephone and asked to reconsider her refusal. And she was glad she had. Before her, on another mat, lay the remnants of a dinner unique in her experience. Dan had called her a good sport, and she had this evening proved him to be correct. On bundles, she had tasted everything. Poi served in individual calabashes, chicken stewed in coconut milk, squid in shrimp, limu, or seaweed, even raw fish. She would dream tonight. Now, the feasting had given way to the dance. See patterns on the lawn. The plaintive wail of the music rose ever louder. The Hawaiian young people, bashful at first in the presence of strangers, were bashful no longer. Miss Minerva closed her eyes and leaned back against the trunk of a tall palm. Even in Hawaiian love songs, there was melancholy. It touched her emotions as no symphony ever could. A curtain was lifted, and she was looking into the past, the primitive, barbaric past of these islands in the days before the white man came. A long, heartbreaking, the music stopped. The swaying bodies of the dancers were momentarily still. It seemed to Miss Minerva's friends an opportune moment to depart. They entered the house, and in the stuffy little parlor, took leave of their brown, smiling host and hostess, The baby whose arrival in the world was the inspiration, for the luau awoke for a second, and smiled at them too. Outside in the narrow street, their car was waiting. Through silent, deserted Honolulu street, their car was waiting. Through silent, deserted Honolulu, they motored toward Waikiki. As they passed the Judiciary Building on King Street, the clock in the tower struck the hour of 1. She had not been out so late, Miss Minerva reflected. Not been out so late, Miss Minerva reflected, since that night when a visiting company sang Parsifal at the Boston Opera House. The iron gates that guarded the drive at Dan's house were closed. Leaving the car at the curb, Miss Minerva bade her house were closed. Leaving the car at the curb, Miss Minerva bade her friends good night and started up the walk toward the front door. The evening had thrilled her, and she moved with the warm, confident stride of youth. Gan's scarlet guarding was shrouded in darkness, for the moon, Gan's scarlet guarding was shrouded in darkness, for the moon, which had been playing an in-and-out game with the fast-moving clouds all evening, was again obscured. Exotic odors assailed her nostrils. She heard all about her, the soft, intriguing noises of the tropic night. She heard all about her, the soft, intriguing noises of the tropic night. She really should get to bed, she knew, but with a happy Truant feeling, she turned from the front walk and went to the side of the house for a last look at the breakers. She stood there, under the door leading into Dan's living room. For nearly 2 weeks, the Kona wind had prevailed, but now on her cheek, she thought she felt the first kindly breath of the trades. Very wide awake, she stared out at the dim foaming lines of surf between the shore and reef. Her mind strayed back to the Honolulu she had known in Kalakaua day, to that era when the islands were so naive, so colorful, unspoiled. Ruined now, Dan had said, ruined by a damned mechanical civilization. Dark waters flowing still. The moon came out, touching with silver the waters at the crossroads, then was lost again under fleecy clouds. With a little sigh that was perhaps for her lost youth in the 80s, Miss Minerva pushed open the unlocked door leading into the great living room not to waken Dan. An intense darkness engulfed her, but she knew her way across the polished floor and set out confidently, walking on tiptoe. She had gone halfway to the hall door when she stopped, her heart in her mouth, for not 5 feet the style of a watch, and as she stared at it with frightened eyes, it moved. Not for nothing had Miss Minerva studied restraint for more than 50 years. Many women would have screamed and fainted. Miss Minerva's heart pounded madly. But she studied that phosphorescent dial. Its movement had been slight. It was now at rest again. A watch worn on someone's wrist. Someone who had been on the point of action, but had now assumed an attitude of cautious waiting. Well, she asked herself, what was she going to do about it? Should she cry out, a sharp, "Who's there?" She was a brave woman, but the foolhardiness of such a course was apparent. She had a vision of that dial flashing nearer, a blow throat. She took a tentative step, and then another. Now surely the dial would stir again. But it remained motionless, steady, as though the arm that wore it were rigid at the intruder's side. Suddenly, the wearer of the watch, had forgotten the telltale numerals on his wrist. He found himself hidden in the dark. He was waiting for her to go on through the room. If she made no sound, gave no sign of alarm, she might be safe. Once beyond, she could rouse the household. She was a woman of great willpower, but it took all she had to move serenely on her way. She shut her lips tightly and accomplished it. veering a bit from that circle of light that menaced her. Looking back at it over her shoulder as she went, the bamboo curtain received her. She was through it. She was on the stairs. But it seemed to her that never again would she be able to look at a watch or a clock and find that the hour is anything save 20 minutes past 1. When she was halfway up the stairs, she recalled that it had been her intention to snap on the lights in the lower hall. She did not turn back, nor did she search for the switch at the head of the stairs. Instead, she went hastily on into her room, and just as though she had been an ordinary woman, she closed her door and dropped down trembling a little on a chair. But she was no ordinary woman, and in 2 seconds she was up and had reopened her door. Her sudden terror was evaporating. She felt her heart beat in a strong, regular rhythm again. Action was what was required of her now, calm, confident action. She was a Winterslip, and she was ready. The servants' quarters were in a wing over the kitchen. She went there at once and knocked on the first door she came to. She knocked once, then again, and finally the head of a very sleepy Jap appeared. "Haku," said Miss Minerva, "there is someone in the living room. You must go down and investigate at once." He stared at her, seeming unable to comprehend. "You must go down," amended Miss Minerva. Wiki. He disappeared, and Miss Minerva waited impatiently. Why hadn't she seen this through alone? At home, no doubt she could have managed it. But here, there was something strange and terrifying in the very air. The moonlight poured in through a small window beside her, forming a bright square at her kimono that he often sported on the beach. Another door opened suddenly, and Miss Minerva started. What ailed her anyhow? She wondered. It was only Kamaikui, standing there, a massive figure in the dim doorway. Up in the living room, Miss Minerva explained again. "I saw him as I came through." Kamaikui made no reply, but joined the odd little procession. In the upper hall, Haku switched on the lights, both upstairs and down. At the head of the stairs, then, Miss Minerva took her rightful place at the head of the line. She descended with a firm step, courageous and competent, Boston at its best. After her followed a stolid little Jap in a kimono gay with passionate, who wore the fearful Mother Hubbard of the missionaries as though it were a robe of state. In the lower hall, Miss Minerva did not hesitate. She pushed on through the bamboo curtain and her hand. It trembled ever so slightly, flooded the living room with light. She heard the crackle of bamboo behind her as her strange companions followed where she went. She stood, looking curiously about her. There was no one in sight, no sign of any disturbance, that perhaps she was behaving in a rather silly fashion. After all, she had neither seen nor heard a living thing. The illuminated dial of a watch that moved a little. Might it not have been a figment of her imagination? She had experienced a stirring evening. She remembered there had been that small glass of okolehau, a potent concoction. Kamaikui and Haku were looking at her with the inquiring eyes of little children. Had she roused them for a fool's errand? What? Her cheeks flushed. Certainly, in this big, brilliant room, furnished with magnificent native woods, and green with many potted ferns, everything seemed proper and in order. I may have been mistaken, she said in a low voice. No sign of anything wrong. Mr. Winterslip has not been resting well of late. If he should be asleep, we won't waken him. She went to the door leading onto the lanai and pushed aside the curtain. Bright moonlight outside revealed most of the veranda's furnishing. Dan, Miss Minerva called softly. Dan, are you awake? No answer. What is this? Miss Minerva was certain now that she was making a mountain out of a molehill. She was about to turn back into the living room when her eyes, grown more accustomed to the semi-darkness, noted a rather startling fact. Day and night, over Dan's cot, in one corner of the lanai, hung a white mosquito netting. It was not there now. Come, it was not there now. Come, Haku, Miss Minerva said. Turn on the light out here. Haku came, and the green shaded lamp glowed under his touch. The little lamp by which Dan had been reading his evening paper that night, when he had seemed suddenly so disturbed, and rushed off to send a letter to Roger in San Francisco. Miss Minerva stood recalling that incident. She recalled others, because she was very reluctant to turn toward that cot in the corner. She was conscious of Kamayakui brushing by her. And then she heard a low, half-savage moan of fear and sorrow. Miss Minerva stepped to the cot. The mosquito netting had been torn down as though in some terrific struggle. And there, entangled in the meshes of it, she saw Dan Winterslip. He was lying on his left side. And as she stared down at him, one of the harmless little island lizards ran up his chest and over his shoulder and left a crimson trail on his white pajamas. Chapter 7. Enter Charlie Chan. Miss Minerva leaned forward, her keen eye seeking Dan's face. It was turned toward the wall, half buried in the pillow. Dan, she said, brokenly. She put her hand on his cheek. The night air was warm and muggy, but she shivered a little as she drew the hand quickly away. She hurried through the living room to the hall. The telephone was in a closet under the front stairs. Her fingers were trembling again as she fumbled with the numerals on the dial. She got her number. Heard finally an answering voice. Amos, this is Minerva. Come over here to Dan's as quickly as you can. The voice muttered in protest. Miss Minerva cut in on it sharply. For God's sake, Amos, forget your silly feud. Your brother is dead. Murdered. Amos, will you come now? A long silence. What thoughts, Miss Minerva wondered, were passing through the mind of that stern, unbending Puritan? How come? Or like that of the Amos she knew. The police. So I'll notify them, then I'll come right over. Returning to the hall, Miss Minerva saw that the big front door was closed. Amos would enter that way. There was, she noted, an imposing lock, but the key had long since been lost and forgotten. Indeed, In all Dan's great house, she could not recall ever having seen a key. In these friendly, trusting islands, locked doors were obsolete. In these friendly, trusting islands, locked doors were obsolete. She re-entered the living room. Should she summon a doctor? But no. It was too late. She knew that only too well. And the police, didn't they bring some sort of... And the police, didn't they bring some sort of doctor with them? Suddenly, she began to wonder about the police. During all her time in Honolulu, she had never given them a thought before. Away, off here, at the end of the world. Away, off here, at the end of the world. Did they have policemen? She couldn't remember ever having seen one. Oh yes, there was that handsome, brown-skinned Hawaiian who stood on a box at the corner of Fort and King Streets. Directing traffic with an air that would have become Kamehameha himself. She heard the scrape of a chair being moved on the lanai and went to the door. Nothing is to be touched out here, she said. Leave it just as it was. Nothing is to be touched out here, she said. Leave it just as it was. You'd better go upstairs and dress, both of you. The two frightened servants came into the living room and stood there regarding her. They seemed to feel that this terrible affair called for discussion. But what was there to be said? Even in the event of murder, a Winterslip must maintain a certain well-bred aloofness in dealing with servants. Miss Minerva's feeling for them was kindly. In dealing with servants. Miss Minerva's feeling for them was kindly. She sympathized with their evident grief. But there was, she felt, nothing to discuss. After you've dressed, she ordered, stay within reach. After you've dressed, she ordered, stay within reach. You'll both be wanted. They went out, Haku in his absurd costume, Kamaiklui moaning and muttering in a way that sent shivers up and down Miss Minerva's spine. They left her there, They left her there alone, with Dan, and she, who had always thought herself equal to anything, still hesitated about going out on the lanai. She sat down in a huge chair in the living room and gazed about her at the trappings of wealth and position that Dan had left forever now. Poor Dan. Despite all the whispering against him, she had liked him immensely. It is said of many, usually with small reason, that their lives would make an interesting book. It had been said of Dan, and in his case, it was true, what a book his life would have made, and how promptly time from the shelves of the Boston Public Library. For Dan had lived life to the full, made his own laws, fought his battles, without mercy, prospered, and had his way. Dallied often, alone forbidden paths, they said, voice so full of cheer, always, until these last 2 weeks. Roger said, ever since that night he sent the letter to Roger, he had seemed a different man. There were lines for the first time in his face, a weary, apprehensive look in his gray eyes. How furious he had been when, last Wednesday, he received a cable from Roger. What was in that message, Miss Minerva wondered. What were those few typewritten words that had caused him to fly into such a rage and set him to pacing? She thought of him as she had seen him last. He had seemed rather pathetic to her then. when the news came, but the President Tyler could not dock until morning, and that Barbara, Miss Minerva, stopped. He thought of a sprightly, vivacious girl, as yet untouched by sorrow and of the morning's homecoming. Tears came into her eyes, and it was through a mist she saw the bamboo curtain that led into the hall pushed aside, and the thin white face of Amos framed there. Amos entered, walking gingerly, for he was treading ground he had sworn his feet should never touch. He paused before Miss Minerva. "What's this?" He said, "What's all this?" She nodded toward the lanai. After what seemed a long time, he reappeared. His shoulders drooped wearily, and his watery eyes were staring. "Stabbed through the heart," he muttered. He stood for a moment regarding his father's picture on the wall. "The wages of sin is death," he added. "Yes, Amos," said Miss Minerva sharply. "I expected we should hear that from you. And there's another one you may have heard. Judge not, that ye be not judged." Further than that, we'll waste no time moralizing. Dan is dead. And repeated Amos drearily. "How about me? My brother, my young brother, I taught him to walk on this very beach." "Yes." Miss Minerva looked at him keenly. "I wonder, well, a Winterslip. What are we going to do about it?" "Have notified the police," said Amos. "Then why aren't they here? In Boston by this time?" "But then, I know this isn't Boston." "Stabbed, you say. Was there any whatever that I could see? How about that Malay Chris on the table out there? The one Dan used as a paper cutter?" "I didn't notice," Amos replied. "This is the strange house to me, Minerva." "So it is." Miss Minerva rose and for the lanai. She was her old competent self again. At the moment, a loud knock sounded on the screen door at the front of the house. Presently, there were voices in the hall, and Haku ushered 3 men into the living room. Haku ushered 3 men into the living room. Though, evidently, police, they were all in plain clothes. One of them, a tall, angular Yankee, with the look of a sailing master about him, stepped forward. "I'm Halliday," said. "I'm Halliday," said. "Captain of detectives. You're Mr. Amos Winterslip, I believe?" "I am," Amos answered. He introduced Miss Minerva. Captain Howett gave her a casual nod. Howett gave her a casual nod. This was man's business, and he disliked having a woman involved. "Dan Winterslip, you said," he remarked, turning back to Amos. "That's a great pity. Where is he?" "That's a great pity. Where is he?" Amos indicated the lanai. "Come, doctor," Howett said, and leant through the curtain, followed by the smaller of the 2 men. As they went out, the 3rd man stepped farther into the room. As they went out, the 3rd man stepped farther into the room, and Miss Minerva gave a little gasp of astonishment as she looked at him. In those warm islands, thin men were the rule, but here was a striking exception. He was very men were the rule, but here was a striking exception. He was very fat indeed, yet he walked with the light, dainty step of a woman. His cheeks were as chubby as a baby's, his skin ivory tinted, his black hair close cropped, his amber ivory tinted, his black hair close cropped, his amber eyes slanting. As he passed Miss Minerva, he bowed with a courtesy, encountered all too rarely in a workaday world, then moved on after Hallett. Amos, Ida, cried, and moved on after Hallett. Amos, Ida, cried Miss Minerva. Batman. Why he, Charlie Chan, Amos explained. I'm glad they brought him. He's the best detective on the force. But he's a Chinaman. Of course, Miss Minerva sank into a chair. Ah, yes, they had policemen out here after all. In a few moments, Howard came briskly back into the living room. Look, here, briskly back into the living room. Look, here, he said. The doctor tells me Mr. Winterslip has been dead a very short while. I don't want your evidence just yet, but if either of you can give me some idea as to the hour when this thing happened, I can give you a rather definite idea, said Miss Minerva calmly. It happened just previous to 20 minutes past 1. Say about 1:15? Howlett stared at her. I said I saw his wristwatch. Howlett frowned. And I'll get that straight later, he said. Just now I propose to comb this part of town. Where's the telephone? Miss Minerva pointed it out to him and heard in an earnest conversation with the man at headquarters named Tom. Characters. He was also to have on hand, awaiting his chief's return, the passenger lists of all ships that had made port at Honolulu during the past week. Howlett returned to the living room. He took a stand directly in front of Miss Minerva. Now, from Boston? I believe I am, snapped Miss Minerva. Stopping in this house? Precisely. Anybody here besides you? And Mr. Winterslip? Miss Minerva's eyes flashed. He has a daughter, hasn't he? Miss Barbara is on her way home from college. Her ship will dock in the morning. I see. Just you and Winterslip. You're going to be an important witness here that had frightened guards on the Cambridge subway. He brushed it aside. You understand that I haven't time for, please, Miss Winterslip. Go back and describe last evening in this house. Previous to that, Mr. Winterslip dined at his usual hour, and we chatted for a time on the lanai. Did he seem to have anything on his mind? Well, he has appeared a bit upset. Wait a minute. The captain he has appeared a bit upset. Wait a minute. The captain took out a notebook. Want to put down some of this? Been upset, has he? For how long? For the past 2 weeks. Let me think, just 2 weeks ago, tonight. Let me think, just 2 weeks ago, tonight, or rather last night. He and I were sitting on the lanai, and he was reading the evening paper. Something in it seemed to disturb him. He got up, wrote a note to his cousin Roger in San Francisco, and took it down. Wrote a note to his cousin Roger in San Francisco, and took it down for a friend aboard the President Tyler to deliver. From that moment he appeared restless and unhappy. Go on. This may be important. Last Wednesday. Go on. This may be important. Last Wednesday morning, he received a cable from Roger that infuriated him. A cable. What was in it? It was not addressed to me, said Miss Minerva haughtily. What to me, said Miss Minerva haughtily. Well, that's all right. We'll dig it up. Now about last night. Did he act more upset than ever? He did. But that may have been due to the fact that he had hoped his daughter's ship would dock yesterday afternoon, and had learned it could not land its passengers until this morning. I see. You said you was only here until 8:30? I did not, replied Miss Minerva coldly. I said I was here only 8:30? I did not, replied Miss Minerva coldly. I said I was here only until 8:30. Same thing. Well, hardly. I'm not here to talk grammar, Hallett said sharply. Did anything occur? Anything out of the ordinary before? Did anything occur? Anything out of the ordinary before you left? No. Wait a moment. Someone called Mr. Winterslip on the telephone while he was at dinner. I couldn't help overhearing the conversation. Good for you. She glared at the conversation. Good for you. She glared at him again. Repeat it. I heard Mr. Winterslip say, Hello, Egan. Well, you're not coming over? Oh, yes, you are. I want to see you. I insist on it. I want to see you. I insist on it. Come about 11. I want to see you. That was at least the import of his remarks. Did he seem excited? He raised his voice above the ordinary tone. Yes. Above the ordinary tone. Yes. The captain stared at his notebook. Must have been Jin Egan, who runs this god-forsaken Reef and Palm Hotel down the beach. He turned to Amos. Was Egan a friend of your brother? Said Amos. You see, Amos was not a friend of his brother, either, explained Miss Minerva. There was our old feud between them. Speaking for myself, I never heard Dan mention Egan, and he certainly never came to the house, but nodded. Well, you left at 8:30? Now, tell us where you went and when you got back. And all about the wristwatch. Miss Minerva rapidly sketched her evening at the luau. She described her return to Dan's living room, her adventure to pass. I wish she'd seen more, Hallett complained. Too many people wear wristwatches. Probably not many, said Miss Minerva, wear a wristwatch like that one. Oh? It had some distinguishing mark. It's and stood out clearly with an exception. It's a figure 2. It was very dim, practically obliterated. He looked at her admiringly. Well, you certainly have your wits about you. That's a habit I formed early to break. He smiled and asked her to continue. She told of rousing the 2 servants and finally of the gruesome discovery on the lanai. But it was Mr. Amos, Hallett said, who called the station. Yes, I telephoned him. I returned to Amos. How long did it take you to reach here, Mr. Winterslip? He inquired. Not more than 10 minutes, said Amos. You could dress and get here in that time. Amos hesitated. To bed. Hallett regarded him with a new interest. 1:30, and you were still up. I don't sleep very well, said Amos. I'm up till all hours. I see. You weren't on friendly terms with your brother? I didn't approve of his manner of living, and we went separate ways. And stopped speaking to each other. Eh? Yes. That was the situation, Amos admitted. Oh. And Miss Minerva stared at him too. Amos. It flashed through her mind that Amos had been a long time alone out there on the lanai before the arrival of the police. "Those two servants who came downstairs with you, Miss Winterslip," Pollitt said. "The others can go over until morning. My whole Genophyta death could only be working. I think that some of the bullet effect..." The Jap had nothing to tell. He had been sleeping soundly from 9 until the moment Miss Minerva knocked on his door. He swore it. "But call me at Kurbuk. I come here with fruit." She pointed to her basket on the table. "On the nigh out there are talking, Mr. Dan. A man, a woman. Oh, very much angry." "What time was that?" Howard asked. 10 o'clock. "Did you recognize any voice except your master's?" Miss Minerva thought the woman hesitated a second. "No, I do not. Anything else?" "Yes. Maybe 11 o'clock. Yes. Maybe 11 o'clock. I'm sitting close to window upstairs. More talking on lanai. Mr. Dan, another man. Not so much angry this time. At 11, so much angry this time. At 11, do you know Mr. Jim Egan?" "Some. I have seen him." "Could you say if it was his voice?" "I could not say." "All right. You two can go now. You two can go now." He turned to Miss Minerva and Amos. "We'll see what Charlie has dug up out here," he said, and led the way to the lanai. The huge Chinaman knelt, a grotesque figure by the table, and he rose laboriously as they entered. "Find the knife, Charlie?" the captain asked. Chan shook his head. "No knife or present in neighborhood." Chan shook his head. "No knife or present in neighborhood of crime," he announced. "On that table," Miss Minerva began, "there was a Malay kris, used as a paper cutter." The Chinaman nodded and lifted the kris from the desk. "Remains here still," he said, "untouched, unsullied. Person who killed carried individual weapon. How about fingerprints?" asked Hawaiian. "Considering from recent discovery," Chan replied, "search for fingerless one." He held out a pudgy hand, in the palm of which lay a small pearl button. "Twine from kid's glove," he elucidated. "Aged trick of criminal mind. No fingerprints. Is that all you've got?" "Sincere endeavors," said Chan, "have revealed not much. However, I might mention this." He took up a leather-bound book from the table. "Here are written names of visitors who have enjoyed hospitality of the house. Is, I believe, the term. You will find that one of the earlier pages has been ruthlessly torn out. When I make discovery, a volume are lying open at that locality." Captain Howard put the book in his thin hand. "All right." The slant eyes blinked with pleasure. "Most interesting," murmured Chan. Howard tapped the notebook in his pocket. "I've got a few facts here for you. We'll run over them later." He stood for a moment, staring about the lanai, shy on clues. A button torn from a glove, a page ripped from a guest book, and a wristwatch with an illuminated dial on which the figure 2 was damaged. Chan's little eyes widened at mention of that. Not much, Charlie, so far. Maybe more to come, suggested the Chinaman. Who knows it? We'll go along now. Howlett continued. He turned to Miss Minerva and Amos. He turned to Miss Minerva and Amos. I guess you folks would like a little rest. We'll have to trouble you again tomorrow. Miss Minerva faced the Chinaman. The person who did this must be apprehended. She said firmly. He looked at her sleepily. What is to be, will be, he replied in a high, sing-song voice. I know. Well, that's your Confucius. She sapped. But it's a do-nothing doctrine. She sapped. But it's a do-nothing doctrine, and I don't approve of it. A faint smile flickered over the Chinaman's face. Do not fear, he said. The fates are busy, and man may do much to assist. I promise you, there will be no busy, and man may do much to assist. I promise you, there will be no do-nothing here. He came closer, humbly asking pardon to mention it. I detect in your eyes slight flame of hostility. Quench it, if you light flame of hostility. Quench it, if you will be so kind. Friendly cooperation are essential between us. Despite his girth, he managed a deep bow. Wishing you good morning, he added, and followed Howlett. Miss Now. Wishing you good morning, he added, and followed Howlett. Miss Minerva turned weakly to Amos. Well, of all things, don't you worry about Charlie, Amos said. He has a reputation. Forgetting his man. Forgetting his man. Now, you go to bed. I'll stay here and notify the proper people. Well, I will lie down for a little while, Miss Minerva said. And I shall have to go early to the dock. Poor Barbara. And there's John Quincy coming too. A grim smile crossed her face. I'm afraid John Quincy won't approve of this. She saw from her bedroom window that the night was breaking. The rakish coconut palms and the ha tree were wrapped in a gray mist. Changing her dress for a kimono, she lay down under the mosquito netting on the bed. She slept but briefly, however, and presently was at her window again. Day had come. The mist had lifted, and it was a rose and emerald world that sparkled before her tired eyes. The freshness of that scene, she saw, had worked its magic on the blossoms of the haw tree, transformed them from yellow to a rich mahogany. Through the morning they would drop one by one upon the sand. In a distant algaroba, a flock of myna birds screamed at the new day. A party of swimmers, she placed a small object in Miss Minerva's hand. Miss Minerva looked down. She saw a quaint old piece of jewelry, a brooch. Against a background of onyx stood the outline of a tree, with emeralds forming the leaves. Ruby's the fruit. Many years Mr. Dan had that. 1 month ago. He gives it to a woman, down the beach. Miss Minerva's eyes narrowed. To the woman they call the widow of Waikiki. To her, yes. How do you happen to have it? To my community. 3. I will attend to the matter. Yes, of course. The woman went out. Miss Minerva sat very still, staring down at that odd bit of jewelry in her hand. It must date back to the 80s at least. Chloe, sweet girl on the beach, was accustomed to serenade her thus every morning at dawn. His thoughtfulness was not appreciated by many innocent bystanders, but Miss Minerva's eyes were sympathetic as she watched him sweep exultantly far out over the harbor.